Welcome to Preserving America, the show about preserving America's antiquities. My name is A.J. Dufresne, and this week we're going to talk about the glass industry in Northwest Ohio. The show is conducted in three parts. The first part we're going to talk about the gas boom of the 1880s. The second part we're going to talk about how the gas boom affected the glass industry in Northwest Ohio. And then the third part we're going to talk about conservation and how as a collector you can conserve your glass that you've collected from the various glass plants that developed in Northwest Ohio. So let's check it out. Now, Fostoria Glass is well known and collected all over the world for its quality tableware and stemware. But why here? Why was Northwest Ohio considered the center of the glass manufacturing industry in the 1880s? Oil and gas, of course. Yep, you heard me, Ohio. Believe me, this place was full of gas. And it was the boom that started the age of illumination. The Fostoria Glass Company began operations in Fostoria, Ohio on December 15, 1887. This site was chosen because a natural gas vein was discovered in the area, and it was so happened 5 different rail lines passed through town. In fact, Fostoria was not unique. Gas and oil was found to be abundant all over Northwest Ohio, as speculators rushed to the area like ants to a picnic. But the boom soon dissipated as gas wells and oil wells ran dry. Speculators, investors, and Rockefellers either got rich, went bust, or moved their factories to a better location. To get a better sense of the history behind glass making in the glass boom of the late 1800s, I went to visit Jack Paquette. Jack is a retired executive from the Owens, Illinois Glass Company in Toledo, Ohio. Jack has written 3 books about the glass industry. His latest is called Blowpipes, Northwest Ohio Glass Making in the Glass Boom of the 1880s.
It all began when gas and oil was found in, by mistake almost, in Lima, Ohio in the 1880s. And because there was an increasing interest in the use of natural gas in the manufacture of a lot of products, including glass of all types, the boom really created a great deal of interest on the part of glass makers who were concerned about high fuel costs in the East while moving west.
Large amounts of natural gas have been discovered in the area. With access to free gas, investors found this city an ideal location to build glass plants. Few towns and cities in the United States have ever experienced a period of time of rapid change like Findlay, Ohio. After the Civil War, many industrialists began looking for new sources of energy that were cleaner and cheaper to produce than burned in coal. They soon discovered that gas and oil appeared to have many domestic and commercial uses. Not long after that, the Carg well was tapped. It was so big they couldn't control it for 4 months. Even grass and dandelions grew near the well during the winter while vagabonds slept near it for warmth. Most importantly, small towns gave wild incentives to business owners to build their plants here.
Among the many companies that moved into the Findlay area and then later other towns in Northwest Ohio were glass manufacturers, because fuel was such an important part of their total cost, and they were being offered in many cases free gas, free land, and some kind of a monetary incentive up to $40,000, $50,000 to build a factory at a time when a glass factory only cost about $40,000 to build. So virtually overnight, all of those Northwest Ohio towns that thought they had gas were swarming with glass manufacturers.
Eventually, the gas boom died out as wells ran dry.
Of the half a dozen companies that we still think about today, like Libby Glass and Fostoria Glass and Tiffin Glass, there were actually more than 70 glass companies I was able to identify that established a beachhead in Northwest Ohio, a relatively small, mostly agricultural area, Toledo being the the only large town in the entire area along Lake Erie.
Only Toledo, the latecomer, remained as a viable manufacturer of glass. Others moved to where the gas was abundant, such as Moundsville, West Virginia, and eastern Indiana.
Fostoria is a classic example. Fostoria desperately wanted gas. Their supply ran out very quickly. So they literally lined the streets with gas pipes and then ran pipes several miles to an area outside of Fostoria in southern Wood County, Ohio, south of Bowling Green, where there were large deposits, and piped it in and gave it away for a while. And then they discovered they were losing so much money they began charging for it, and the glass manufacturers particularly got very angry. Some of them left town because of it. They really wanted the free gas. They were making a lot of money off of it, off the use of it.
Everyone has a gas story, and this one is no different. It was used, abused, and burned up. The only things that remained were big Victorian houses, speculators, hookers, empty hotels, and land. Land that once changed hands 6 times now was found very cheap.
The other thing that interested me was the classic boomtown psychology or philosophy. People came in from all over the world, literally, to make money off this gas boom and the later oil boom. And there were speculators, and there were con artists, and there were prostitutes, and you name it, anything to make some money off of the free gas that was available. In most of the glass factories, and this was very surprising to me, because glass is a very skilled trade. It's very, to this day, it's very much of an art rather than a science. And years of experience are required to make glass. And these factories were being started by local merchants or lawyers or doctors. A lot of doctors involved, physicians, who saw opportunities to make money. And some of them were wise enough to hire experienced glass people to actually run the plants, but others didn't. And they had a great deal of problems in the startup of these factories and trying to run them. The other thing that was happening too, because of all the freebies that were involved with the establishment of these factories, many of them were manufacturing products they shouldn't have manufactured. There was an overabundance, for example, of window glass. About a quarter of these factories made window glass, about a quarter bottles and jars, and the balance was more home use, consumer type glass, or art or decorative glass. And they really didn't need as many window glass factories as were built during that period, but they were fairly easy to build, and it was a hand-blowing process. They blew huge cylinders of glass and slice them down the middle and open them up and flatten them out into window panes. Yeah, there was a limit on how much window glass was needed around the country, and they were shipping out of this area as far as St. Louis and as far east as New York City. But there still was too much glass of that type being manufactured. And these men were neither glass marketers nor glass manufacturers, and those businesses failed fairly quickly.
Well, that is the story of the gas boom and its demise, but don't let that encourage you to turn the channel. The most interesting part of this story is the glass blowers. These men traveled from Europe, partly recruited because American men didn't know anything about blowing glass. These new immigrants were put to work on furnaces, continuing a long tradition that goes back many centuries.
Tell me about the collectors of, for example, Fostoria Glass, Tiffin Glass, and what drives them to collect this glass? What makes it so collectible and have so much intrinsic value?
Well, you use the word intrinsic, and I think that's an important word to use, important adjective. There is an intrinsic beauty about glass, the way it reflects light, the way it allows light to pass through it and pass its color on to another surface. I think it's the beauty to begin with, the uniqueness of it, its malleability, its shape, its form.
On this site in the 1880s stood a glass factory in Findlay, Ohio. To get a sense of what it was like for the glassblower, we went to visit Robert Hurlstone, a master glassblower at Bowling Green State University.
Basically, the first thing you have to overcome is walking up to the furnace and getting used to the heat. I mean, that's the first obstacle. The first time you do it, I think everybody thinks, oh my God, I'm never going to get through this. How do people do this? But you get used to it fairly quickly. But you go through and you gather, and you learn how to gather correctly. We did a little gather and a half so that we didn't go too large, but we didn't have a too small quantity. Shape that, blew it out as quickly as possible, but we blow it out as quickly as we can to get to the shape, and then stretch it to the desired end, which was, in this particular case, was stretching it out in a more of a elongated type of form, which could have been turned into an amphora or a cup or any other thing. But we just stretched it out to a little cup and by heating it, and then the gather occurred, colorless, and that was placed on the bottom. It has to come over fairly rounded and hot so you can manipulate it. But in this particular case, not really extremely hot, because then it takes forever to get it to cool. And you want to get going and getting opening up and putting this piece away. After we got the bottom shape, then we went ahead and punnied, transferred it from the blowpipe onto the pontile rod, or nicknamed punny, and heated, put all the heat on the top, and then opened it up to the desired, size.
What is the purpose of spinning?
Oh, yeah, well, like I said, we were working pretty cold furnace over here, so I had to really kind of spin it around in circles to get it to stretch. You're taking advantage of centrifugal force and gravity, always in glass.
Then you take it over there, you break it off, and you put it in this oven?
In the annealing oven, and what that chamber does is it holds the glass at the appropriate temperature and then brings it down to room temperature in a correct time, so that it's not too quickly, and then the glass is safe
How long of a time
strain-free.
How long of a time are we talking about?
Oh, on something like that, we had the cookie on the bottom. That requires a little more length of time for the annealing, but we'll typically run it overnight, 8 hours.
Oh, really?
If it's just a thin little cup or a vessel, virtually you can put it in there and turn it off. Just drop it straight down. It'll be fine. But on thicker pieces, you have to go through a more elaborate annealing process. If you're doing casts, that's 6 to 8 inch mass, you have to deal with a lot different type of format. You may be looking at, a week to 2 weeks worth of time, depending upon its shape, etc., to get that annealed properly without it having so much strain that it will crack.
Today we're in downtown Fostoria, visit the Glass Heritage Museum, and we're going to talk to Ed Reed, who's going to tell us about collecting glass. Come on.
My favorite piece is right here. This is Artichoke, also by Fostoria Glass Company. You can see why it's called artichokes, frosted artichoke. Its real name is Valencia.
Why the difference? Artichoke, Valencia, why the difference? Why two different
The glass company called it Valencia, but everybody looked at it and said it looks like artichokes to me.
Collectors called it artichoke.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
The value of something.
I don't know. To be honest with you, I paid around $200 for this. If you offered me $1,000, I wouldn't sell it to you. The most frequently asked question in the gallery here is, how do you tell? How do you know what's the glass made in Fostoria? Is it marked? No. None of it's marked. This is tableware. This is not the kind of glass.
Tableware meaning daily wear.
Yes.
They use it on a daily basis.
Yes. It was not meant to be in a museum. Fostoria Glass never had any concept that it was going to be in a museum, but it makes a nice museum. The way that we knew was that there was a gentleman here in town, in fact he's still here in town, who became our first curator by the name of Melvin Murray, who had in 1972, I believe, brought out a book called Fostoria, Ohio Glass. This is a piece that we found in Indianapolis this past week. This is called crisscross for obvious reasons. Very rare, difficult to find. This particular piece has been broken. There's a crack in it along the top here somewhere. I can't see it.
Has it been restored?
Yes, but this particular pattern, which was made by Consolidated Lamp and Glass, is one of the finest examples of what they do. This is a company called Fostoria Glass Specialty, and they made Tiffany style glass. Now if you look at that, it's gold on the inside, then white with leaf and vine on the outside, and then like you would do with frosting,
Right.
they took gold glass
Dribble it over?
and dribbled it over. This is the only piece of this pattern, well, up until this past weekend, this is the only piece of this pattern that we had ever found at a show or in a mall. You just don't see it. It's amazing how many people have come in. People come from all over because of the reputation of the Fostoria Glass Company primarily.
Now that we know the history, composition, and manufacturing process of glass, let's go to Cleveland, Ohio to visit the Inter-Museum Conservation Association to find out how the professionals preserve their glass.
Inter-Museum Conservation Association is a nonprofit organization. It's a regional center. There's 6 or 7 regional centers in the U.S. We deal with a consortium of museums that we treat objects for. They don't have their own conservation departments, so we work on their objects. And, the kinds of objects we treat are paintings, oil paintings, mural paintings, paper objects, prints, drawings, watercolors. And my specialty is objects, which is kind of a catch-all phrase for anything three-dimensional: glass, ceramics, stone, metals, so on. So we deal with pretty much any kind of art material. We do both conservation per se, treating the artwork, and also preventive conservation. The specific characteristics of glass is that it's made out of silicon, is the basic glass former. It has fluxes in it and stabilizers. If there's conditions that cause the glass itself to deteriorate, for example, if it's buried in a well, something like that, it can the surface can start to dissolve away some of the ions, some of the alkali ions, which are the main flux of the glass. In that case, you have to consolidate the surface, make it so that it can be handled, so that it's not as fragile as it would be if it's just flakes of glass. We use different kinds of materials for those treatments. Consolidants can be something like an acrylic resin that we apply to the surface, and it soaks in and acts as a matrix to preserve the deteriorating glass. When something's broken, we use, there's several different ways that we can approach broken glass. If it's thick, we can use a similar acrylic adhesive. If it's a thin surface, that means that there's not a lot of cross-section for the glass to adhere, so we don't have a lot of surface area to attach to. In those cases, we have to use a stronger adhesive, which will hold those parts together in their proper position. But the trade-off is that with the acrylic adhesives, for example, they're much more reversible. You can, if at some point in the future you need to replace or redo the treatment, if it's discolored, if it's yellow or something like that, you can fairly easily get it apart. But with an epoxy, say, it's very difficult to get it apart. So it's a kind of an ethical decision about whether you want to do something that's irreversible, can never be taken apart, in order to preserve or to get the piece to look the way it's supposed to do.
For somebody who's a collector, that means what you want to make sure you do is have a stable environment for your collection to be in. You want to have a temperature in the range of around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 5 degrees. Relative humidity you'd want to have in a pretty stable, between 45% relative humidity, give or take 5%, even up to 55, 60. Any higher than that, you have the danger of weeping, which is a condition that occurs when you do have too much humidity, and you get kind of a soapy feel on the surface of your glass. Or if it's too dry, you end up with crizzling. And both of these are irreversible products of having an unstable environment. As when you have glass, you have the network former, which is your silica, and then you have your modifiers, and that's your soda or potash, and then the stabilizers, which are lime or lead. When you have conditions that are too wet, you're leaching those modifiers out, so you only end up with your skeleton structure, basically. So what happens is it can be very fragile, it can fall apart, it becomes difficult to handle. So the best thing is to keep it stable.
It's, solarization is what happens when manganese, which is used as a decolorizing agent in the glass, is affected by direct sunlight. The photons in the sunlight change the oxidation state of the manganese, and it turns kind of pinkish purple. So in some cases, if there's say a glass that's been sitting out on a front window or something like that, over time it can turn a slight purplish color. So in many cases, it would be advisable to have your glasses in a cabinet, not in the direct sunlight.
Thank you for joining us on Preserving America, the show about preserving America's antiquities. Join us next time as we preserve America's lost treasures.